The next lake in line for our ultimate guide to linear fisheries is Brasenose 1. Now Brasenose 1 is one of the largest lakes on the linear complex at a little over 30 acres in size and is without a doubt the flagship water on the whole of the complex. It's a venue that I fished ever since the day that it opened back many moons ago, and it offers such fantastic fishing. Now the fishing on Brasenose 1 can be massively hectic, but at the same time, considering its stock of over 1900 carp, it can also be a little bit tricky as well. Now of those 1900 carp, 3/4 of those are over £20, and I would estimate now in the region that probably 300 of them are over £30, with around 20 to 30 over 40, and the lake record currently sitting at over £50. In my personal opinion, I firmly believe that Brasenose 1 is the premier big fish day ticket lake in the country. So without further ado, we're going to go for a walk round. I'm going to show you the swims that I favour, a little bit more in depth about Brasenose 1, how I fish it at certain times of the year, and more importantly, the right tactics that you need to be employing when you come up and fish Brasenose 1 to have a great session. Before we get into this video any further, you will probably notice that the water level behind me is a lot higher than what it usually is. Now we have been granted special permission from Linear Fisheries to come down and film this walk around whilst the lake's closed. It just makes sense to do it now because Brasenose 1 is a big lake, it's a very, very busy lake, and the way that these walk arounds work, for us to get as much information across to you guys and gals as possible, we like to go into most of the swims, and there's nothing worse than when you're fishing and someone comes walking through your swim trespassing with a camera. So yeah, that's the reason why we're here now and the water's high and the lake is closed. Now the peg that I'm actually stood in now is peg number 1. Without a doubt, one of the most overlooked pegs on the whole lake. It's in the very first bottom end corner as you drive in on the lake, and what you generally tend to find happens is where there's a lot of other anglers fishing around the lake, they'll actually park across the entrance to this swim. So a lot of people don't actually know that it's here, but believe it or not, peg 1 is a very, very good peg throughout the whole time of the year. It isn't a summer peg, it isn't a spring, it isn't an autumn, or it isn't a winter peg. It fishes all year round. And the reason why it fishes all year round is because it's a very quiet, tucked away corner. And much like any other pressure day ticket venue that you'll fish, the small, quiet corners are generally where the carp will end up, certainly when there's a lot of anglers on. Now, whilst it's in the corner and away from a lot of the pressure, it also gains access to one of the only features on Brasenose 1, which is a small, almost sunken island type feature just out to the left-hand side of this peg. Now, I fished in this peg only a couple of times before, but I've caught very, very well fishing just off the side of it. In the winter now, it's a couple of feet deep on top. In the summer, if the water goes right down, you can just make out the top of it. So fishing down off the side of it is definitely a good area to fish. The fish patrol around it all the time, and there's a big gap between peg 1 and peg 2. Now also along to the right hand side, you've got a no fishing margin. And like I've said on a lot of the videos that I've done already, if you've got a no fishing margin, it's always an area that will hold fish. I'm not saying it will hold numbers of fish, but if I was to fish in here now, or if I was to fish here in the summer, I'd be confident that by having a rod along that no fishing margin, at any given time of the day, I would have carp passing over my rigs. The beauty as well with peg 1 is it isn't a long range peg. You know, it suits everybody, from the guys that can cast long or for those of you that can only cast short. I would say the maximum cast that you'll be looking to do in peg 1 will be anywhere between 10 and 12 wraps, depending on whether you're fishing on the bar or down to the right along the no fishing margin. So I'm just stood at the front of the peg now, where you would be fishing if the water level was down. And the front of the plateau, or the right-hand side of the plateau, should I say, there's a little high sort of peak of the silver birches on the opposite bank, and it's bang in line with them. But what I haven't already mentioned as well is because of the distance between peg 1 and peg 2, you've also got this left-hand margin, which is an area that only this peg can access, because believe it or not, peg 2 is quite overgrown and you can't cast this way. So you've got a lot of water down to the left that you otherwise wouldn't be able to fish from another peg. And also, like I say, over my shoulder here, this is the no fishing margin, and the next peg isn't until you get halfway along what we call the trout bank. With Linear Fisheries being such a big outfit, they do cater for absolutely everyone. And the peg that I'm stood in now is in fact peg 3. Now pegs 2 and 3 on Brasenose 1 are disabled access friendly swims. Now one of the biggest misconceptions when it comes to the disabled pegs on Linear is a lot of people think that you can't actually fish them. Now you can fish them even if you aren't disabled, but disabled anglers do take priority. But these pegs are absolutely fantastic. You know, not only do they offer great access if you are coming and you are a disabled angler, angler, but they're also nice and comfortable swims. And around the complex, they generally tend to put the disabled access pegs in the very good consistent areas of the lake. Now the peg that I'm stood in here is in fact peg 3. Peg 2 is just over my shoulder there, and they command so much water. Obviously peg 1 is the first peg, which is down to the right of peg 2, so you've also got a little bit of that margin, and you've also got the other side of that plateau. Out in front of peg 3 here, you've got the sort of mouth of the opening of where it sort of goes from shallow to deep. Now, one thing I would say is a lot of people say, oh, the shallow end of Brasenose 1. It isn't like it's a couple of feet, you know, you're still talking 11 to 13 feet with the deeper end being upwards of 16 feet. So you've got a really, really good depth of water out there. And what you also find as well is the warm prevailing winds. Anything with a west, southwest blows down here as well. And it is a very, very consistent area, not only in the summer, but also in the winter as well. Because again, like I said about peg 1, an area like peg 2 and 3 where you have got quite a gap between the two swims, you've got a lot of water out in front. The fish on busy places tend to end up where there isn't a lot of line. So pegs 2 and 3, very, very good swims all throughout the course of the year, but more so when it blows a nice warm southwesterly wind. Now the whole of Brasenose 1 is pretty featureless. Like I've already said, the only real prominent feature is in front of peg 1. Peg 2 also has access to what would be the left-hand side of that feature, and out in front of peg 2 and out in front of peg 3, it is very, very flat. One thing that I would always recommend with Brasenose 1, it isn't about casting to the moon, but it's about fishing a comfortable range that you can cast to. You're not going to come here and spend hours and hours and hours leading around, try and find little seams of silt, little seams of gravel, because they're simply not out there. Pegs 2 and 3, much like the rest of the lake, cast to a comfortable distance, clip up, make sure you bait accurately, and I guarantee you'll have a good session. So moving up the lake now, pegs 4, 5 and 6. Now these pegs are quite close together, but as you start coming up the lake, you start getting in to what I would call the central area of Brasenose 1, which is a very, very good area, especially this time of year when the water temperature drops right down. Now 4, 5 and 6 are quite close together when you look at them on the map, but when you actually stand in these pegs, what you notice that peg 4 and peg 6 both have a lot of space left and right of them. So what it means is peg 5 does actually have a lot more water than what you might initially think when you stand here. Now like I say, pegs 4, 5 and 6, very, very good pegs. Peg 6, where I'm stood now, is in fact where I caught the beast of Brasenose, 51 pounds and 12 ounces. And I've also had a lot of big carp from this area here as well. Like I say, 4, 5 and 6, they get you access out into that middle part of the lake. And like I keep saying, busy places like this, middle of the lake where not many people can reach, not many people can fish, these sorts of areas are always going to be key areas in holding carp at all times of the year, especially now when the water's a lot cooler. With regards to distances, now much like a lot of the pegs on Brasenose 1, like I've said before, the lake is completely featureless. You're not going to be looking for anything in particular. You're going to want to be fishing as accurate as what you possibly can. Now if I was to turn up here today and the guy to my left was fishing 80 yards and the guy to my right maybe was fishing 65, 70 yards, I'd look to not go much further than what the guy's fishing 80 yards, maybe 85, 90 yards, but I certainly wouldn't be looking to going out fishing right out in the middle. Brasenose 1 is all about accuracy. It's not about going maximum range. It isn't about spraying bait everywhere. It is about fishing accurate. What I would normally do on a typical session, I'd rock up in the van, I'd get the gear out, I'd get set up, I'd put my wrapping sticks out, I'd wrap up at a nice comfortable range given the conditions. With the wind like it is today, a bit of a crosswind, I'd clip up at 25 rod lengths, irrespective of where anyone else is fishing around me, and I'd make sure I'm fishing as accurately as what I possibly could at a range that I'm comfortable to fish at. And much like I've said before in previous videos, whatever way the wind direction's blowing, it can very, very easily change. Certainly when you're fishing around this Oxford area, you know, it seems to have its own small sort of microclimate, so to speak. So even though the wind today is a crosswind and I could comfortably fish 25 wraps, if the wind was to turn and go off my back, I wouldn't necessarily want to go further and fish, say, 110, 120 yards. I want to concentrate all of my feed in one area, because what you find on Brasenose 1 is the fish are very, very shoal orientated. If you bait it up on a spot and the fish haven't come over it on the first night, there's a very, very good chance they're going to come over it on the second night. And the worst thing that you can do is blank on a spot one night, change everything for the second night. You're going to blank on the spot that you've baited for the second night, but you'll never know. The fish might have come in and fed on this bait that you initially put out on the first night. So my biggest piece of advice for Brasenose 1 is fish a distance that you're comfortable with and stick to that spot, and don't go chasing the fish. Let the fish come to you. Now, there isn't a great deal of horizon markers in these pegs, but what I do is I just pick a spot aim at that spot throughout the course of the day, and what you find is where you're regularly putting bait out, naturally at night you're sort of guided to casting that way anyway. There is a couple of little ups and downs. Obviously these will help you as well, but one thing that I do is set my rods quite a distance back from the water's edge at night. So what I can do is when I'm casting, actually straddle over the tip sections of my rods, so I know if I'm casting down the line of the rods that are already out there, I'm maintaining the best accuracy possible. So just to summarise then, pegs 4, 5 and 6, I'd be happy to come in these pegs and fish anywhere between 20 and 25 wraps, knowing that I'm out there in the pond where the fish are. I'm now stood in peg 7. Now peg 7 is the most central swim on the whole of the road bank that you drive in on, and without a doubt it is one of the most desirable pegs on Brasenose 1, and rightly so, because undoubtedly this is the best peg on the lake. The reason why it's the best peg, first and foremost, it's in the centre of the lake. So if the wind's blowing an easterly and it's blowing up to the causeway bank, or if it's blowing a south-southwesterly and it's blowing down to the trout bank, you've always got passing traffic. Any lake that you can fish to, generally the peg that is in the middle of the lake will always be the most consistent throughout the whole course of the year. Aside from that as well, is it's consistent spring, autumn, summer and winter, especially now when it's in the winter. The fish seem to congregate out into the middle, and what they'll do generally on Brasenose 1 is they'll tend to branch right or left of this spot, but they will always come back and they will always sit in front of peg 7. Now another reason why this peg is so good, and there are a few reasons why this peg is so good, is because to the left used to be peg 8, but what they've actually done is they've taken peg 8 out of the equation and they've shut it, which just means that 7 is now got a big leap till you get along to peg 9, and it's also quite a walk to get from peg 6 to peg 7. And when you actually look at peg 7 from the opposite bank, it offers the most amount of bank space between a group of pegs, which again, like I keep saying, is vital when you're fishing busy day ticket waters. Somewhere that you've got a lot of water that you can control what the fish are doing, will ultimately give you a lot more success. Now another reason again why this is a very, very good peg is because it's the first sort of peg along this bank where you've got some real prominent horizon feature markers. So not only does it make it very easy to fish during the day, but it also makes it very easy to fish during the night as well. And another thing as well, much like I said about 4, 5 and 6, it isn't a massively long range, long distance peg. I've caught fish out of here fishing at 80 yards. I've also caught fish out of here fishing at 110, 120 yards. But generally, because you are left alone, because there is such a big gap between 7 and 9 and 7 and 6, you can sort of pick the distance that you want to fish, because you've got such a large area of water that this peg commands. The fish will come into it from all different directions, and without any shadow of a doubt, if you was to ask me what the most consistent peg on Brasenose 1 would be, it would be peg 7. I'm stood in peg 10 now, which is another firm favourite of mine. To the right, you've obviously got 9, and to the left, you've got 11. Again, much like fishing in peg 7, you've got a lot of water out in front of these pegs. Peg 10, like I say, one of my firm favourites, as is 9. 11 is also a very, very good swim as well. I more favour the left-hand end of the lake when the wind blows an easterly, say from 11 upwards, or indeed when it gets to the real depths of winter and you're not able to find the fish anywhere, because what generally tends to happen is they sit out in the widest part of the lake, and that's something worth noting as well. So if you actually look at Brasenose 1 on paper, you can't really tell until you actually stand on the lake, but what it does do is it starts to sort of taper out, and as you get further and further up the lake towards the causeway end, it starts to widen out. Now, in today's era, I would say that the average caster is anywhere between 80 and 110 yards. In fact, when you get up to sort of 10, 11 and further up, the middle of the lake is in excess of 140 yards, which is a very, very long way out. You know, even I wouldn't come here and fish that far out. And it's an area of the lake where the fish spend a lot of time, purely and simply because they get pummeled by leads, and they spend a lot of their time sitting out in the middle. And 9, 10 and 11, again, they give you great access out into the middle. But much like fishing further down the lake, there's no features out in front of them. You've just got quite a few prominent horizon markers in the distance, and all I do, like I've already said, clip up to a spot and fish where you're comfortable. One thing it's worth mentioning at this stage is the depth of Brasenose 1. Now down the bottom end, which is what people call the shallow end, I know I've already said, it's around 10 to say 13 feet given the time of year. But as you start coming up the lake, so from say maybe 4, 5 onwards right up to the causeway bank, you've got depths of up to 16 feet. So what that also allows you to do when you're fishing Brasenose 1 is not just solely fish down on the bottom. You've got a lot of depth of water in front of you that you can experiment with, and they are shoal fishing here. So the chances are that the shoal is going to be anywhere from on the bottom to maybe 6 or 8 feet up, or they could be 6 or 8 feet off the bottom right up to just below the surface. So whenever you're coming to fish Brasenose 1, make sure you've got absolutely everything, from fishing down on the bottom to fishing with zigs to spotting slop over zigs. Again, that is something that works very, very well on here. And over the past few years, you know, that's a sort of a bit of a forgotten tactic. And with how many big fish are in here, you know, I always say this to myself, and I've seen it happen firsthand when I fished other venues, and in fact I saw it firsthand when I fished at a place in France. Dropped some bait from a bait boat and the fish actually came in and they mopped the free bait up and the rig dropped to the bottom and the fish never returned. And I do think that happens quite a lot, certainly with Brasenose being one of the deepest lakes on the complex and one of the most heavily stocked. I think a lot of the time that you're putting bait in on here, the fish are actually eating it before it gets to the bottom. So it is always worth having your zig stuff ready, because if it isn't happening on the bottom, a quick change over to zigs can definitely turn your session around. The beauty of it being so deep as well is every now and again you do get lucky and you do actually tap fish on the way down with your lead, which obviously gives you a very good starting point. But me, if I was to turn up and fish here today, given the conditions, I would always start off mid-water. So 7 to 9 foot, and I'd probably go up to maybe a couple of feet below the surface. I wouldn't go right under the surface, certainly not at this time of year anyway, but I would also go right down and fish maybe a couple of 3 feet off the bottom. Because what you generally tend to find, and I've seen this on underwater videos as well, is a lot of the fish are always 2 to 4 feet off the bottom. And unless you've got a bright visual bed of bait down there, it might not be enough to attract the fish down onto the bottom. So definitely zigs are a massive edge. And the one thing as well that Brasenose 1 has taught me over all my years of fishing is to study the birds. You know, this is what I would call the ultimate bird water, if you like. If I turn up here now and I was to see a group of tufties, irrespective of what the weather was doing, I would turn up and I would sit and I would study those birds, because those birds work very, very closely with these fish. You've got to remember, there's no weed in this lake and there's no features. The only reason birds are going to be in a certain area is because there's fish there. I firmly believe that the fish and the birds work together, because both of those are animals, both of them want to eat, and if one's eating and the other one isn't, they're going to investigate and they're going to want to get in on the action as well. So I'm up in the top road bank corner of the lake now, pegs 12 up to 15, which is the last peg on this bank. Now these pegs are very, very good swims. They fish particularly well when the wind is blowing any form of easterly, certainly a northeasterly. It pushes right into this bank, and a northeasterly wind is quite a rare wind. So when it does blow that, it never blows it for very long, or it hasn't blown it for a very long time. So the fish will generally tend to proper stack up on it. And the beauty with these pegs up here is you're sort of tucked up out the way, and again, no one can really interfere with your water. You've got the causeway pegs, which are just over on the left, which slightly limits the distance that you can fish. But again, much like a lot of the other pegs that I've already spoken about, you don't need to fish any further than around 80 to 100 yards out of these pegs. And one really, really good thing with these swims as well is these are renowned pegs for doing great hits of fish off the surface. Certainly if you're prepared to wake up very early on a summer's morning and put the effort, you can have some mega hits of fish. And peg 15, which is the very end peg, again is a brilliant peg. Much like swim 1, you control the water that's in front of you. So off to your left hand side, you've got a no fishing margin. If you see a number of fish in there, you can choose how you want to fish for those fish. You can either go hell for leather, fish them and try and catch as many as you want and push the fish out, or you can just bait up, leave it for a couple of hours, catch a couple, let the fish build confidence in there, and you can build a real hit of fish. So this top end of the lake, I would say, is probably one of the most neglected areas, but it is a very, very good area. And again, you've got some real nice prominent horizon markers. But much like everywhere else on the lake, it's very flat, very uniform on the bottom. You've just got to make your bait the feature. So I'm now up on what is known as the causeway bank of Brasenose 1. And what this is the bank between Brasenose 1 and Brasenose 2. Now these 3 pegs here are in fact absolutely fantastic pegs. You've got peg 16 and 17, which is almost like a double swim, and peg 18, which is a little bit further along, which is a bit of a standalone peg. Now these are very, very good pegs for quite a few reasons. First and foremost, you have access to the centre of the lake. So over on my right hand side, as I'm looking out of the lake, you've got pegs sort of 12 to 15 that in effect would be fishing, say, 100 yards out. And then over to the left, you've got pegs 20 to 23, which again, if they were both fishing at 100 yards, you've got a lovely channel of water right down the middle, which is an area of the lake where the fish do spend a lot of time. Not only that as well, they do spend a lot of time up here through the hours of darkness. Now that is one thing that I haven't mentioned yet. Bite time on Brasenose 1 can be at any time, but this causeway bank, and I don't know for whatever reason this is, I've always found that it is a very, very good area for getting bites through the hours of darkness. Now I'm not saying you don't catch them through the day, but when it's dark, it just seems to be a little bit more prolific. And as well, it is a very, very good area in the winter. It's the deepest end of the lake. It's about 15, 16 foot out in front of it. And if you're fishing in here and it's blowing any form of easterly, so a southeast or a northeasterly wind, the fish, let me tell you, absolutely stack up in front of it, and you don't need to fish that far. In terms of distance, fishing out of peg 16 and 17, which is what I'm stood in here, I'd probably be looking to fish at maximum 110, 120 yards, and then from peg 18 next door, I probably wouldn't fish any further than about 80 yards. Now, one thing with the end of the lake, like where we are here now, is I know it sounds obvious, but the fish are going to be travelling up the middle of the lake and they're almost going to be headbutting this bank and they can't go any further. The one thing that I have learned in the past is, say I was coming in this peg now and I was to fish at my maximum distance, say 120 yards that I could fish out of here, I'm not giving the fish any reason to come in any further. And what that's doing is it's just making everything a little bit harder for me. So by it being the end of the lake, I'd probably only start fishing at, say, 80 to 90 yards and just give myself plenty of room, because there's nothing worse. And, you know, I've done this so many times. Baited up to my maximum distance, it's not happening on the bait, and you haven't got any more options. You've sort of exhausted them all, so to speak, because if you've put bait out at distance, the likelihood is the fish aren't going to come past that bait and they're going to come inside it. And the only way you're probably going to get a bite is to fish past it. And if you've baited at your maximum, I know it sounds obvious, but you can't go any further out. Now, a couple of other things to mention when fishing off the causeway, much like the rest of the lake, and I know I keep saying it is a bit of a common theme with Brasenose, it is very, very flat out there. So in terms of finding a feature, again, pick a distance that you can bait comfortably. And a couple of advantages that this peg has over anywhere else is these are actually the only pegs on the lake that you can see the whole entire lake from. So by sitting up in these pegs here, if you do see fish showing elsewhere, it's very, very easy to sit on your bed chair, look out, and you can see the whole lake and you can make a move. And not only that as well, if you poke your head over the hedge behind, you can have a little look onto Brasenose too. So if it's not happening on B1, you can literally flick behind and you can fish on Brasenose too. So yeah, this is the causeway bank, a very, very good area throughout the whole course of the year. But if I was to come up here, it would be in the summer on an easterly wind, or it would be in the winter when nowhere else is fishing. You can't find the fish. Come up here. It's deep, always going to hold fish, and much like today, it is a massive, massive sun trap. And much like a lot of the other pegs around the lake, you have got some quite prominent horizon markers. So all I say when people are fishing or ask me what the crack is with fishing on Brasenose 1, I never deviate much left or right of the peg. And the reason why I don't do that is because you can never account for what angler is going to turn up next to you. So always pick the most visual marker that's directly in front of you. That way then you're controlling the bait and you're controlling the fish that are in your swim, and you're not sitting there worried that if someone turns up next door to you, they could potentially ruin the session that you're having. So I'm round on the back bank of Brasenose 1 now. Peg 19 is up to my left-hand side, and it obviously goes round in numerical order. So you've got 19, and then just to my right here is peg 23. Now, these pegs here, as many years as I've fished on Brasenose 1, I haven't done as much time in here as what I probably should have done. And the reason is with a lake like Brasenose 1, I'm not coming up here and looking to get into a certain swim at any particular time of year. You know, the way in which this lake operates, the fish are massively governed by angling pressure, and they're also massive by the wind and the weather as well. Now, these pegs over here, these sort of take the brunt of a southeasterly. Now, it isn't very often that it blows a southeasterly, but when it does, these pegs here are very, very good. This side as well, it's worth mentioning, is naturally shallower in the margins than what the far side is. So one thing that you will find is if you are looking to fish over here, certainly in the warmer months, you're going to have a lot more weed present in the margin than what you are on the far side. Now, what this does entail as well is it also brings the fish in a lot closer to this bank. And I've been here on multiple occasions and seen guys that have had really good trips here fishing just over the back of the weed, because the lake is so barren out in front, any form of little feature that pops up, certainly weed beds, is going to be a natural magnet to the carp. And as well, when people come to a place like Brasenose One, the first thing that they want to do is they want to try and fish to the far side. And I think a lot of the time people are missing opportunities by not fishing short. You know, you're fishing over the fish. The only place these fish aren't being fished for is right in the margin, and that's why this area is very good. And as you can probably see today, with the sun beating down on me, we're right in the middle of winter now, and this takes the full brunt of the winter sun. This time of year, carp are cold-blooded, they're looking for a little bit of warmth. For me, this is a place where the carp are going to be looking to come over and warm themselves up. And indeed, this is a very good area for the winter as well. Like I've already mentioned, when fishing over on the far side, you know, in your 13, 14, 15 area, this is the widest part of the lake. It's an area of the lake where the fish will go and congregate, certainly when it gets a lot cooler, out in the middle, and this gives you good access to getting out to those fish. But as a general group of swims, this area here, absolutely fantastic. But one thing to remember, if you are going to fish Brasenose One on this far side, the weed will be present in the summer. So if you are fishing shock leaders, I'll potentially lengthen the length of your shock leader, just so when you get them fishing a little bit closer, you can reel that shock leader onto your reel and you can give them fish a little bit more beans to get them up out of the weed. So I mentioned that you can fish closer in over the back of the weed. Obviously as well, you can still fish out as far as what you want to go. I probably wouldn't go any more than about 120 yards, but the beauty with these pegs over here, and I haven't actually mentioned this yet, and to some people you might find this a little bit bizarre, but where the pegs are quite close together on Brasenose One, what generally tends to happen is someone will get a bite and the fish kites. There's nothing you can do about it. It is part and parcel of fishing on busy day tickets. But the beauty with these selection of pegs here, it's pretty much the only area on the whole lake that you can do it, is if you are fishing out at range and the fish kites, it's easy to just walk between the pegs and easily and safely land the fish. So yeah, fishing around this sort of area here, 19 is a little bit of a shorter range peg because it is in the corner, but you can back your van up to it so it's nice and comfortable to fish. But certainly these pegs here, as you start to go along the bank, you can fish out anywhere between sort of 100 and 120 yards. And like I said, about 16 feet of water out there. Again, very, very barren, but it is an area that holds fish. And I've caught fish all the way along this bank, fishing on the bottom and also fishing with zigs as well. One thing is worth noting as well, and before I move on, peg 19, much like peg 15, is in the corner. So whereas in 15 you've got the left-hand margin to fish, in 19 you've actually got the right-hand margin. And the way in which the lake is constructed, you've got a lot more margin fishing out of peg 19. It's a brilliant, brilliant area for holding fish. And like I've already said, when it comes to a corner peg, you can control the pressure that you put on. So if it's blowing a nice wind in there, fish short, fish up against that margin and let the fish come to you. So moving along the bank a bit now, you've got pegs 24 all the way down to just before it goes around on the point, peg 32. Now all of these pegs are absolutely fantastic pegs, and I've caught carp from all the way along this bank. Now what's slightly different to this bank as opposed to the opposite bank is you'll notice the gap between 7, 9 and 6 is far greater than what it is amongst any of these pegs over here. Now from my experiences, the first bank that you drive down, 6, 7 and 9, those areas generally tend to be a lot more consistent. And I think that is down to how much water each of those pegs control. Whereas when you come over this side, you're almost battling with the guys left and right of you, purely and simply because there's a lot more pegs over here and they are spaced very evenly apart. But all that means is you do generally tend to share the fish that are swimming out in front. And it isn't much hardship for you to put a few more spods out than the guy next door and drag the fish away. Whereas if you're fishing opposite, you've got a lot more water that you can sort of hold the fish in, and obviously the longer you can hold the fish there, the far greater that your session is going to be. But like I have already mentioned, this bank over here, it does take the winter sun straight away, which obviously will also mean that it takes the sun throughout a majority of the year. And what it also does as well is this takes any warm south-southwest prevailing wind right onto this bank. And even though these fish have been massively pressured, gravel pit carp will generally tend to follow one rule, and that is the wind. Doesn't matter how long a carp's been in the lake, no matter what day ticket venue I fish, no matter what gravel pit I've ever fished, always on the end of the wind will be some form of fish activity. And these pegs over here are very, very good pegs for fishing short range. Now by short range, I mean up to 80, 90 yards out. Again, when the weed gets up in the summer, fishing a couple of rod lengths behind that will also produce fish. But like I said there, when the wind's smacking over into this bank like it quite often does, it's a big lake, you know, it's 30 acres, it's open, and it doesn't take a lot for a wind to pick up across here. Fishing accurately and effectively at 80, 90 yards, I've had some of my best ever trips fishing fishing up there, and this particular peg that I'm stood in now, peg 25, is a personal favourite of mine. First and foremost, I can pull the van right up behind the swim, and let's be honest, that's a bonus wherever we go. The peg's nice and flat, it's nice and clean, I can get myself proper set for a session in here, and what you've also got as well is out in front, you've got some real prominent horizon markers. So much like fishing opposite in peg 7, it commands dead centre of the lake, but you've also got some real prominent horizon features that are easy to fish to at night, but are also easy to fish to during the day. And I think that's one of the biggest keys when you're fishing a place like Brasenose 1, a place where you can expect some real hectic action at times. If you can fish day and night and keep that swim being built up, you can have a really, really good trip. Brasenose 1 is pretty uniform anyway, and much like fishing on the opposite bank, it is a similar sort of depth. When you get out to about 60, 70 yards, it peters out and it goes down to around 15, 16 feet, and it stays that then all the way until you get across to the other side. So like I keep stressing, and I know it seems like I'm going on and on and on, but I've seen so much stuff written in the past and so many videos shot in the past where people tell me that they found features out there, or they've seen features in Brasenose and they found this and they found that. There is nothing out there. The biggest key to fishing this place is accuracy. And on a day where you could get the slightest breeze blowing that might hinder your accuracy, even if you've got to come in a little bit closer, make sure you fish as accurately as possible. You know, I would go as far to say that fishing on Brasenose 1 over the years that I have has probably taught me more about carp fishing than anywhere else that I've ever fished. And what I mean by that is it's taught me how to combat fishing in side winds, because you do get big, big side winds on here. It's taught me how to fish when there's undertows, which is something I'm going to mention in a minute. And it's also taught me how to bait a swim and how to effectively bait a swim. And what I mean by that is when you're fishing down in 15, 16 feet of water and you're looking to fish on the bottom, it's knowing how to get your bait down on the bottom. It's a very, very easy thing to do when you're fishing on a shallow lake, but when you're fishing on such a big open pit like Brasenose that's deep, being able to get your bait down where your rigs are is massively, massively key. And like I just touched on there, undertow. Now this is something that a lot of people don't ever take into consideration. I think really because not many people speak about it, and it isn't sort of common knowledge to a lot of people, and it takes a little bit of understanding. So say for example we've got a massive wind that's sprung up from the west and it's blowing left to right, for argument's sake. In effect, when you cast out, your bow will be going with that wind, which is obvious, you know, but when that wind hits the bottom of the bank and the water starts turning over, the undertow does in fact go the opposite way. So when you're baiting up, your bait might look like it's going slightly to the right of where you're spotting, but in effect, what's happening is the undertow is actually pulling your bait back over or sometimes away from your rigs. And I see so many people do this, and the simple tip that I always go by, and again, I've done so much fishing over the years, you know, not some of the things that I say, people might think, well, that's a bit sad to know that that does that or that does that, but over the years, I've learned, and when I go fishing, I'm effectively going to work. So I want to try and have the best possible chance of catching as many fish as what I possibly can, or putting in as much effort as what I can. And one of the ways that you can combat this, and I've done this on so many occasions, and I reckon it's caught me multiple carp over the years, is wherever my rods are, I'll lift the lines ever so slightly out of the water, just so they're probably from the point of the line exiting the water to the rod tip is about a foot, just so I can see the shadows that's being cast by the line. I'll grab a handful of bait, I'll chuck it right over my middle line, and what I do then is I watch that bait as it sinks. Now you might be thinking, well, that's a pretty sad thing to do, but what you can judge by that is how far that bait is being pulled in the undertow. And then you've got to sort of work out a little bit of an equation as how far is that bait potentially travelling when you're fishing out in the middle of the lake. But by doing stuff like that, if you're aiming at a certain tree, but you've seen that bait that you've put in there has travelled a foot down and it may be gone 6 to 8 inches left or right, when you're fishing over, say, 16 feet of water, if you're spotting a rod length to the right of your spot, by the time your bait's hit the bottom, it could be absolutely bang on. And all of these small little percentages in carp fishing make the biggest difference. Down onto the point area of Brasenose 1 now, pegs 33 all the way round to peg 41, and I've left peg 42 out for a bit of a specific reason. Now, like I say, we're out on the point area. The first peg that you come to when you come out onto the point is peg 33. Now, this is a little bit different to the other pegs in a sense that it controls a lot of a bay that you've got access to down on your right-hand side. Now, this bay is predominantly a lot shallower than the rest of the main body of water. It gets exceptionally weedy, but with this comes a great carp holding area, and I've had some absolutely fantastic sessions fishing in this peg, fishing short, fishing in little holes that appear in the weed. Aside from that as well, this whole point area takes the full brunt of a southwesterly wind, which, let's be honest, as carp anglers, if it's blowing a southwesterly wind, it sort of gets us ready, gets us revved up and makes us want to go carp fishing. And on a big open gravel pit like Brasenose one, they're going to follow it, and they always end up out in front of this point, and you don't need to fish very far out to catch them. Now, in terms of times of year that I would fish off of this point area, I'd probably not only fish it in the warmer months, but it wouldn't be my first port of call when it gets a lot colder. The fish generally tend to sit out sort of from the 6 side of the lake, almost to peg 28, a little bit further up, so they're out of range of these swims. But what these pegs also do is they give you good access, certainly 34, 35, 36, they give you good access fishing up the middle of the lake, much like the causeway, but obviously from the opposite end. So as the fish are travelling down the lake, certainly if the wind's looking to change, maybe it's been blowing a southeasterly up the other end and it switches to a southwesterly, you can intercept the fish off of this point area before they actually go down into the narrower end. And one other thing to note with these point areas is you actually get a lot of water from each of these pegs. And the reason you do, imagine it's a little bit like a bicycle wheel, like the spokes. The sort of the central hub is the back of the point, and the pegs all fan out off of that point. So you've each individually got a large section of water in front of you just because the way in which the pegs are facing. Now, again, much like the rest of the lake, completely featureless out in front of here. Pick a horizon marker, find somewhere that you're comfortable fishing with and fish to that. But like I've already mentioned, when it comes to the undertow, certainly if it's banging a massive southwesterly down here, always look to bait up this side of your rigs, because the way in which the undertow work is it will be dragging your bait away from where your spom's landing, and before you know it, you're baiting over the back of your rigs. The fish are coming to your swim from the back to the front, they're eating all the bait first and they're leaving your hook baits. One other thing that's worth noting as well is 90% of Brasenose 1, you can drop your gear off behind or you can park behind your swim. If you are looking to fish out on this point area, you will need to bring a barrow or be prepared to carry your kit, because there's a car park just on the entrance to the point, but if you're fishing further around, there is no access with a vehicle, so you will have to either barrow your kit there or carry it around. This peg that I'm stood in now, peg 42, is one that I've sort of called my get out of jail card, and the reason why I've called it that is every time I've come up to Linear and struggled, or it hasn't happened, or I've been on a tutorial when it hasn't happened, I've always come down into this peg and there is always carp in this swim to be caught. And as well, so many times I've come to this place and this peg has been free, purely and simply because no one actually really knows that this peg's even here. They go to the last trout bank swim, there's a tiny little track that leads round to this peg, and to be honest with you, unless you've been here multiple times, you wouldn't even know that this peg actually exists. You can't really see it from the car park when you drive in, and even if you do go down on the trout bank, you can't actually see this peg either. But believe it or not, it does actually control quite a lot of water. In fact, I'll go as far as to say that this peg probably controls about an acre of water. It's completely reed lined, there's a big bay down to the left. There is the odd little snag, nothing major, and I think it's just sort of big rocks that have been left here when the lake's been excavated many years ago, but it also holds quite a bit of weed in the warmer months as well. But something that's very interesting about this peg is I've fished here for a number of years now, and fishing out in the middle is all well and good, and when you're catching it's absolutely fantastic, but you can wake up in the morning having not caught nothing through the hours of darkness and wonder where the hell all those carp have gone. And on so many occasions I've come down here, sat here for a couple of hours and just seen tiny little pinprick bubbles, and what you generally tend to find is the whole entire stock of the lake, or a majority of the stock, it seems like the whole stock, but it's probably just a large proportion of the stock, pushed down into this bay. And even though it's only small, because it's neglected, the fish can sort of sit down here sometimes for a couple of 3 weeks, and they can just sit away from the angling pressure. A prime example of this, a couple of years ago I was fishing, it was the week before Christmas, I was in peg 7, I was doing some filming, 24 hours in, hadn't even had a bite. Come for a walk down here, sort of 6, 7 o'clock in the evening, my mate come down, he was sat on the rods listening out for them, come for a walk down here, and I heard a few fish showing down here, packed up from there in the morning, come down to here, 18 fish in just a day, because this is where they was deciding to sit, because it was nice and quiet. And like I say, it's just a bit of a hideaway, a bit of a getaway area, and it's probably the last place that people would expect the carp to be. And much like today, a nice bright day, that sun is beating down into this bay, and depending on what way the wind's going, a majority of the year it's pretty sheltered, so it's always warm. So this is a swim that I would highly recommend, that if you are coming to Brasenose 1, walk that extra little bit, you know, come round to peg 42, have a look, because when you're down here, you wouldn't even know that you were fishing on the linear water. It's so quiet. You've got your own little bit of quietness, your own little bit of sort of heaven, if you like, and it's an area of the lake that always holds carp. You've actually got quite a good depth of water out of here, considering it is in a small little bay. It's anywhere between sort of 6 and 10 foot, depending on where you go. Obviously, the further down into the bay you go to the left, the shallower it gets. And as you start to come out into the open water, it does get a lot deeper. And one thing that I will mention as well is this peg, no other swim can interfere with it, because even if you are fishing on what I would call the last trout bank peg, which is peg 43, you can't fish right, so you can't in effect affect what any angler in this peg's doing. So once you've got the fish in here, you can choose to fish from how you want to fish from. Much like the other corners, if you've got a corner, your own little piece of water, you can control how you want to fish for them. So like I say, peg 42, if you're coming up to linear and you've had a little look around all the other venues, I can almost guarantee you that 90% of the time you could walk around into this peg and it'll be free. But believe me, this is one of the best pegs on the lake. One area of the lake that we haven't been able to access today due to the high water is down on the trout bank. Now the trout bank, as I know it, is the bank on the right hand side, so pegs 43, 44 and 45, which are the last 3 pegs. 44 and 45 is almost a double peg, but much like the causeway, you're facing right up the lake, so you can see all the way up the lake, so it gives you a really good vantage point. When it's blowing a real strong westerly, the fish push down there and you can catch fish down there anywhere from under your rod tips out to about 60 or 70 yards. Peg 43 almost fishes off the back of peg 42, so to speak, but with the way the reeds are and the way that the pegs cut back in, you can't actually get access to that bay, but you can fish underarm there, fish nice and short, and you can catch the fish as they're coming around. But again, like I said about peg 42, whenever you're coming up to linear, always have a look along that trout bank, because a lot of people park in that bottom car park and the last thing they think of doing is walking through that little walkway down onto the trout bank. And on so many occasions I've turned up on here, the lake's been extremely busy, gone down onto the trout bank, caught a few bites, packed up, gone home, and no one has even known that I've been fishing. I'm just going to end this by doing a little bit of a summary about Brasenose 1 itself. Now, first things first, if you haven't fished here before, don't be put off by the fact that it is a big open gravel pit, because the fish in Brasenose can be caught at all ranges. It's written about and it's spoken about now on so many platforms that you've got to come here and you've got to cast to the horizon, and that is simply not the case. I've had most of my best sessions on here fishing at ranges that every single angler that I've ever fished with has been able to achieve. You know, I fished down in the trout bank end, so to speak, and I've caught fish at 10, 12 rod lengths, and I fished up in the middle part of the lake and I've caught fish regularly, fishing 22 to 25 rod lengths, a nice comfortable range. Now, one thing that Brasenose 1 has taught me through my fishing over the years, like I've already mentioned, is about baiting and bait application, looking to read the water, you know, and by that what I mean is looking at what's going on in front of you, looking at how you can make your baiting strategy a lot better than the guys either side of you, but most importantly, how to get the bait that you're feeding down on the bottom. And over the course of the years that I fished here, my mix has changed massively. You know, years and years ago, I used to use so many different bits and pieces, didn't really know what rate any of it really sank. And most of the time now, looking back, I was probably baiting up a million miles away from where my rods were. But as you'd have seen my fishing develop over the years, the mix that I use now serves a purpose. And that's sort of been born around fishing on Brasenose 1 quite a bit. Like I say, it's taught me a lot. It's got everything that you need to learn. It's deep, you're fishing in amongst other anglers, and also as well, you've got varying different undertows, and at the same time as well, you're catching. And the only way you can really learn and adapt and change is if you are catching. And like I say, the mix that I use now, it all serves a purpose. I've got the heavy mulched up boilies in there, the sweet corn, the hemp, and indeed the naturals. Brasenose 1 is heavily dominated now by natural baits. Now what I mean by the naturals is the worms. You're not allowed to spod maggots and casters, but you can use these in bags, which is a massive edge, but with the worms. And what I see a lot of people doing is adding worms to the mix that they're using. They're rich in amino acids, they're adding the soil with the depth of water. The bait is simply drifting away and you're not capitalising on that bait that you're putting in. So it's taught me a lot about the bait that I use in my fishing and understanding how I use it. Now, aside from fishing down on the bottom, Brasenose 1 is an absolutely phenomenal surface fishing water. Now, by no means am I standing here an expert when it comes to fishing on the surface. In fact, most of the time when the fish are up on the top, I'd sooner pack up and wait until the weather turns and they go down on the bottom. But believe me, I've had a couple of phenomenal trips fishing here on the surface. So if you're coming up to Brasenose, you can catch them on the bottom, you can catch them on zigs, and you can also catch them fishing on the surface. With regards to the swims on Brasenose 1, yes, I do have a couple of areas that I would favour to go at certain times of the year. Anywhere in the central zone, sort of 4 up to peg 11, and then on the opposite bank 23 to 28. They are the general areas that I would tend to target in the winter, but it isn't a God-given that the fish are going to be there all the time, and occasionally I do branch off and go up towards the causeway or down the bottom end and go hunting for fish. But when it comes to fishing here in the summer or in the warmer months, I'm not driving up here with a specific swim in mind. I'm coming up here to try and find a peg that gives me the best possible chance of getting bites. And whilst there is a lot of fish in Brasenose 1, and I hear so many people time and time again, runs water this, runs water that, let me tell you, I've spent many a night on here pulling my hair out, struggling for bites, because there's many carp that are in here and how easy they can be to catch on their day. Believe me, when the weather turns and things aren't in your favour, the fish in Brasenose can be very, very hard to catch. And I've sat here on multiple occasions when I thought I should have been catching, and I have in fact caught absolutely nothing. But like I keep saying time and time again, this lake has been great for me to learn the behaviours of carp and what bait to put in. And all the while you're doing this, in my honest opinion, I firmly believe that Brasenose 1 is the best big day ticket open access fishery in the UK. There is nowhere else that you can go to have access to this many big carp that come out regularly, that also come out all throughout the year. So before I go fishing anywhere, I'll always check the wind. Now, like I've already said, Brasenose 1 is a large open gravel pit, and these fish, despite being fished for regularly, they do still act in a semi-natural way, so to speak, so they will follow the wind. So what I do, like all the lakes that I go to, I pull up a map, look at what way the wind direction's going, and I sort of base my choice of area that I'm looking to be fishing on what way that wind direction will be going. Now, I know this is going to sound a little bit mad and maybe a little bit contradicting, but when it comes to the winter fishing and it's blowing a south-southwesterly wind, I'll always look to fish on the opposite bank, purely and simply because it's a lot more comfortable. And what I found in the winter is the fish tend to back away from any wind. Certainly when it comes from a wind from the south, because they can be blowing for a long time and they can become stale and the fish can get quite bored of them very easily. But when it comes to the warmer months, the slightest little change in direction, I will always act on that really, really quickly, because they do move like the wind, and 1 minute they can be at one end, the next minute they can be at the other end. So anything with an easterly in will be blowing up towards the causeway bank end, so I'll be looking to fish maybe 11 up to 15 all the way along the causeway bank, or indeed from peg 19 down into 23. Anything that's got any form of westerly in it, whether it be a northwesterly or a southwesterly, I'll be looking to fish down the trout bank end, because the fish are naturally going to follow these winds. I know I've touched on this a few times before, but Brasenose is a very big lake, and there is a large proportion of the water out in the middle that doesn't often see leads. Now, I see a lot of people rock up here, they've got their new rods, their new reels, they want to try and spot at 120, 125 yards, and what they actually end up finding is the guys that are fishing either side of them, fishing shorter, generally catch more fish than what they do. Now, the only thing that I can think of, well, there's a couple of things really why this is probably happening. First and foremost, it doesn't matter who you are. You know, I fished for a very, very long time, and I would class myself as someone that can cast fairly far, fairly accurately. When you're over sort of 110, 120 yards, no matter how accurate you think you are, your accuracy is always massively impaired, just because the nature of the tackle you're using, whether that be the stretch in the mono that you're using, how you're holding the rod, or indeed the bow in the line. And it just makes baiting for these fish very, very difficult. And as well, and probably the biggest thing, the fish aren't used to being fished for out there. Yes, they sit out in the middle to get away from the pressure, but ultimately those carp know that if they want to come in and have the most amount of food, they're probably going to be coming in maybe 80 to 100 yards off the bank, because that is where your average angler is going to be fishing. In terms of rigs for Brasenose 1, again, most people know me for using a D-rig, a long fluorocarbon D-rig, and this venue here, I have used it time and time again, and it isn't very often that I will come on here and get multiple bites and even lose a single fish. I feel for a place like Brasenose 1, fishing down on the bottom with your hook line flat or just off with a really, really critically balanced bait is a massive, massive edge. But one thing that I have noticed over the years is how these fish feed. You know, I think they're always down on the bottom, they're always grubbing around, they're always feeding. And it seems to be quite fashionable nowadays for maybe fishing short rigs. But I think the way these fish have been fished for over the years, I generally tend to find that I feel a longer rig would give me a better chance of hooking a fish, just because they're not expecting it. You know, they're used to seeing tight patches of bait, they're used to going down on the bottom and picking everything up. With a long rig, you've got so much movement in that rig. I think it's movement that the carp aren't expecting. So like I say, when it comes to rigs, long fluorocarbon D rigs for me is the best line of attack. Don't get me wrong, I've chucked pop-ups out in there, I have caught on them, but if I was to put my money on a rig producing time and time again, it would have to be something with the hook fished either on the bottom or just slightly off, but a super critically balanced hook bait. So I hope that's given you a real in-depth insight into Brasenose 1. Like I say, it is one of the best premier big fish day ticket water in the UK. And all of this information that I've passed across to you guys and girls today is all information that I have sort of built up, learned, made mistakes by over all of the years that I've fished here. You know, this isn't passed on information, this isn't second-hand information, this is stuff that I've learned. And believe me, I've spent a lot of my angling life in and around the complex. I did, in fact, help put the fish in Brasenose 1 all those years ago, before there was no pegs and it was completely covered in reeds and you was catching fish underarm on little bags of pellets. So I might not know all the fish personally, but I know a lot about this lake and I fished here a lot. So yeah, all of this information is first-hand information from my book that I write everything down in. And yeah, I just want to pass all this over to you lovely people, so when you come up to Brasenose 1, hopefully it will help you put a few extra carp on the bank.